of the pioneers of the independent networks. I'm your host, Ricky Blues. This is your co-host, Lord Timothy Walker. Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing our Grade 8 look for our introduction to Season 8. This has been quite interesting so far. This is the second part of it. Today we're going to address the topic of our top 8 promotions with an underscore on 8, because apparently last week I slipped a couple extra in.
Someone can't count.
Someone, the counting failed math. Is that what it is? Or accounting? One or the other?
We need our executive assistant to re-add up the numbers.
Well, the score was in, and I was told I slipped 3 extra in there. So I'll make up for it this week. I'll skip like number 7 on my list.
That'll really throw everyone off.
So, folks, if you've joined us in the past, you know that we bring you all the characters, the matches, the promotions, the analysis of the independent wrestling scene in the Mid-Atlantic from the 1970s to today. That's some good times. How'd you like how it deviated, huh?
Yeah, I like that.
So, fans, join us for part 2 of our Season 8 intro. All right, Lord Timothy. So, last week you began. You gave your list first of the top 8, your top 8 villains. I gave my list of my top 11 villains second. So this week, it's only fair that I go first.
All right. Why don't you put your cards on the table?
All right. I've got my cards on the table, and I'm ready to show my hand, starting with my number 8.
You know what we do to people that cheat at cards?
Oh, exactly. Those are the boys that gets executed.
Wow.
The OK Corral style.
That's the old way of doing it.
So my number 8, speaking about OK Corral, this is just a little northwest of there. Speaking of northwest, how about the Northwest, Pacific Northwest Wrestling from the 1980s? That would be my number 8. Now, obviously, Pacific Northwest has been around for a long time. 1925, Don Owens is when it was actually came in and it was passed to his son. But in 1992, the late 80s, by 1992, Sandy Barr buys the promotion and becomes strictly, an independent. I liked the people that came through there. You talk about Jesse Ventura, Roddy Piper, person from my list last week. Buddy Rose made a lot of money up in there. But there's a few other people too.
Jimmy Snuka.
If you really think about it, that had a lot of impact in wrestling, and actually from Pacific Northwest, which I'll talk about in my number 7 here, and I'll give you that name in just a second, but then influenced the Mid-Atlantic. But your general thoughts about number 8, my Pacific Northwest, what do you think?
That was a great promotion in its time.
Billy Jack Haynes, I think.
Billy Jack Haynes was incredibly popular.
Right.
Rip Oliver.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
He was a big star there.
Yep.
Buddy Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Piper. And occasionally Ric Flair would make an appearance in the Northwest for his friend Don Owen.
Right. And again, that is when we were looking at a portion of a territory. The ties obviously there to the NWA, and then it's separating when Sandy Barr took over and really becoming an independent, and that was the late 80s.
And when they had television in the Pacific Northwest,
oh, yes,
they would run 7 or 8 events a week.
Yes. They were moving. They were making money.
It was just amazing. And they had actually even purchased a building specifically to tape television.
Right.
And it was so interesting how they would do their Saturday night television. Part of the show would air live on the local television station. Mm-hmm. And then the second half of the show would be dark. So the fans would have to come out
to actually see
the main events on the show.
But what they saw on the television was building. So it wasn't like you were getting just some dark match tryouts on television.
Oh, no.
You were getting storyline that built that made you say, now I got to run out and go.
Now you have to run out and go when the shows are coming to the different parts of Oregon and right. Washington State.
Absolutely.
And they would run 7 or 8 different events a week, sometimes twice on Saturday.
Yes. Again, great area. One of the people, and I'm going to throw this name out to you, but it's going to segue to my number 7. How about John Rambo? John Rambo had his ties in the Pacific Northwest.
That's really where he made a big name.
Right, he cut his teeth. Where did he come from, or where did he come to after that? Tricky Dick, National Wrestling League, right out in Hagerstown, Maryland.
That's right.
And with Dick in 1989, 90, 91, did those world tours where Saipan, Marshall Islands, all out in the Pacific. I thought that was excellent, and he had great feuds with one person from our list, Max Thrasher.
Oh, yes.
So I look at what the NWL did in those early days as my number 7. And it has a nice little tie back to my number 8.
Interesting.
Very interesting. So my number 6, again, a family business. This one was the Savoldis. Father buying, sons running later on. International Championship Wrestling, ICW, out of New England, out of Boston. And talk about everybody who was anybody coming through there. If you really look at it, we talked about King Kalua and Tom Brandy. They were a staple there. If you think about one of the other people on my list, which we'll talk about later, people from WWA showing up in like Chris Evans and Ray Odyssey. The Tasmaniac. Back before he became Taz, he was the Tasmaniac. So I thought that those guys did, and they also did their world tours, their tours.
They had a lot
overseas.
of touring in the Northeast.
Exactly. So, again, another organization that I thought very good, very well run. That would be my number 6.
I thought it was very interesting when it was ICW and the talent that they would have come through. And at one point, Paul E. Dangerously
yes,
was there. Of course, Kalua and Tom Brandy were the tag team champions at one point.
I think Tony Atlas.
Tony Atlas was their heavyweight champion for quite a long time. And of course, they'd have a lot of former WWF stars.
Yep.
Nikolai Volkov would make a lot of appearances there. Nikolai Volkov would make a lot of appearances there throughout the years. I've seen Greg Valentine, Rick Martel.
Yes.
A lot of different top talents. Tito Santana, Cowboy Bob Orton, in between their different WWF runs.
Right.
They all made appearances there for the Savaldis. It was a very interesting promotion, and they usually would draw good houses.
Exactly.
Here in the Reading and Hamburg, Pennsylvania areas. And then further north, they'd extend into New York and even all the way up to Maine.
Yep.
They had a really large crew of talent. Ray Odyssey and Tasmaniac had some. Ray Odyssey and Tasmaniac had some really good matches that I recall. The television product.
Yep.
It takes a lot of effort to put together a weekly television product.
Episodic, exactly.
It's not easy to do, and they did a very good job with providing a television product not only here in the Northeast, but it was nationally syndicated as well. So they always had a good television presence. It was a very good, it's a very interesting choice.
Yes, very, very interesting. Upward Mobility, they had it.
They did, and they certainly had the television coverage to make an impact on the wrestling scene.
So, Tim, I'm going to look at, for my number 5, a promotion that's very familiar to both of us. One that you covered extensively, one that is still going on today, one that grew out of a partnership that was a very, very heated rivalry for years. One that not only did I work for, but again, had ties to help train the person that opened it. I'm talking about Maryland Championship Wrestling, the Dan McDevitt's version of Maryland Championship Wrestling that came about in, 97, 98, that period there. I look at them as my number 5 because they've had a lot of staying power.
Oh, a lot.
They grew out of the MEWF and then actually from that rivalry merged. Now Dennis and Dan worked together, and they still run it. The promotion is still running today. Um, they've brought in every bit of talent that you could possibly think of, from Flair and the Horsemen to Piper and the Road Warriors. Everybody who's anybody has come through those doors. They give a good presentation. They've developed a ton of incredible independent talent, from Leo Rush through Orlando Jordan to anybody that's ever worked in Maryland has come through those doors as long as they had talent. And that was the big thing that separated them. They didn't just want anybody. They didn't let anybody. If you had talent, they were willing to work with you. Again, excellent promotion, still going today. Done everything from TV. They've done their internet streaming programs, live events, and then they have a business model that allows them to do other things, like they sell their products. They do a traveling like birthday party, personal visits. They visit people, sick children in the hospitals. I mean, things like that endear a company and give it a long-lasting run, and they've had that. So I look at them as a number 5. Quality and longevity.
They've had a really, really long run.
Yes.
With a short break in between, but still one of the longest running independent promotions on the East Coast.
Right.
And Dan McDevitt's probably known as the godfather of Maryland wrestling.
Yeah.
His influence is far and wide.
Yep. He's given a lot of people a lot of opportunities, put together a lot of good shows out there for folks.
Yes, he has. And still, they draw very, very well today.
Yes. Again, I know number 5 doesn't seem like it's high, but you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of promotions, if not thousands. So number 5 is pretty damn high. Number 4, for me, again, I harken back into that late 80s model where you had to use the old school tools, radio, television. There was no internet, word of mouth, tape trading, and good working relationships. So when I look at my number 4, I think about Tri-State Wrestling, Joel Goodhart's. Early incarnations of Ed Zahn's collaborations with Joel. I look at the product that they put together with Phil Livelsberger, with Max Thrasher. The matches that they put together in the arenas that they had, the sellout arenas, the television that they did, the matches with, like we said, Bounty Hunter and Bam Bam Bigelow, with Don Morocco as a special. Everything about what Joel Goodhart did with his Tri-State said big leagues. Radio promotion, obviously, for the obvious reasons why. The coverage in the magazines, they were getting a ton of coverage. The sheets, whether it was Wrestling Observer, whether it was any of those, man, they covered everything that those guys did. And it morphed into an incredible product. Eastern Championship Wrestling, which become ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling. So for me, I look at them as moving into that whole next level. That's why I've got them one step above MCW, because they did take that next step.
Well, their influence is even felt today.
Mm-hmm.
But what a great roster of talent that Joel would bring into Philadelphia for those big quarterly cards.
Oh, yeah.
Jimmy Valiant, Adrian Street, Eddie Gilbert, Cactus Jack.
Abdullah,
the original Sheik, Paul Orndorff.
Al Madrill, Stan Lane,
It was just incredible, the talent that he would bring in from all over the country. Yeah. Jerry Lawler, Kerry Von Erich.
Oh, exactly.
What a great roster. But at the same time, that great roster brought a lot of expense.
Right.
And probably led to his downfall for overbooking those cards.
There's no doubt. There is a triumph and tragedy story that's there that should be told. I hope gets told, that backside, not just the ECW side, but the things that led into it. And that's why we do what we do, because we lived it, we experienced it, we were going through it, so we seen that. I mean, not only the big names that went there. Think about all Jimmy Giannetti, who developed Johnny Hotbody, Larry Winters, DC Drake, all of those guys, Tony Stetson, all of them that came through there. The Cheetah Kid that developed and blossomed, and it wasn't just their big matches like in the Civic Center with big names. I mean, there was if you remember, Tony Stetson and Johnny Hotbody had the barbed wire match on the same card with Cactus Jack and Eddie Gilbert. So you're talking about enough to go around, but you're right. It was ultimately their demise.
And it's unfortunate because they certainly had a big presence. The coverage that they received in the national magazines was incredible. And they certainly changed not only the national wrestling scene eventually, but at the time, it certainly revolutionized the way independent wrestling was done. At that time, when they were starting, most of the independent cards that you would go to would feature one big national name.
Right.
And that national name would probably get paid around $500 for their appearance. So they would probably wrestle the top local wrestler from that area. Well, that changed the whole dynamic.
Absolutely.
When Joel was bringing in 8, 10, 12 national stars to one event, it certainly raised the platform to a point where you needed more, because you could go to Philadelphia and get that much more. And granted, the ticket prices were much higher, but still, it set that bar higher for the competition. And in order for the local independent promotions to draw, they needed to bring in more big names.
Right.
And of course, then pay
big prices.
Big prices.
Step up or step off.
Exactly. So, overall, it certainly changed the whole face of the game. Not only at a national level where ECW made its impact on WWE and its presentation, but also on the local level for your wrestling events at the National Guard Armory,
right,
or the high school gym, that sort of thing. So I think that made a big impact on the whole industry from top to bottom.
And Tim, that brings me to my top three. Ones you're very, very familiar with, ones that we've spoken about time and time again. And I think as we ascend that upper echelon, a lot of great memories come flooding back. As soon as I say the initials, WWA, Larry Sharp. That's my number three. Think about everything that Larry did. He is actually, in my opinion, the guy who has set the model for all the independents that have followed on how to conduct business. Putting together a school, right, the Monster Factory, that fed his business, the WWA or Excalibur Promotions, that created stars. But Larry, because of who he had partnered with to create the Monster Factory and WWA, already had inroads with the WWF,
Right.
He had ties with Tony Gurria, with Chief Jay. They were all in that era together. So when his folks came up that ladder and he developed them to a point, he also was able to get them into a position in the WWF to start to build for themselves. Like the Dwayne Gills, like Glenn Ruth, like Chaz. Those guys all wound up with characters that came right out of what they were doing in the WWA and moved to a national level. Same thing with Balls Mahoney, right? With his character. He had that exact opportunity. Fate played its hand with him and Axel as their tag team, but they were over. They were over big. And it was one of those things that never came to be. But that grounds was the WWA. And there are so many. Chris Candido. I mean, right from there. We've already said Ray Odyssey and Chris Evans. Chris Evans, to me, is when we do an 8 list on that, what a fabulous performer that man was.
So underrated.
Yes. And just, we could probably do an episode just on Chris, his abilities. I mean, just he was another guy that could take a broomstick and make a great match. He absolutely could. But my number 3, WWA, Larry Sharp.
Very solid promotion. Very good business model. Very smart in how he housed his wrestling school in the same building where he could run monthly events. He didn't have to pay any extra rent in order to run his WWA cards there on the first Saturday of every month. And I give Larry a lot of credit too. There was a certain form that he had in running those events. And believe me, they were wrestling events.
Yes.
It emphasized the wrestling and your wrestling skills. It wasn't a clown show. It wasn't built on big, wild, ridiculous, crazy stunts. It was built on the basics of wrestling.
Yes.
It was built on what Larry taught his students. And he expected the matches to go a certain way. And for the most part,
they did.
They did.
5 to 6 matches, Tim. That's really all he used.
That's usually 5 or 6 matches. And they were usually set up so that each match was given a very fair amount of time to develop. And it emphasized actual in-ring wrestling. I can't emphasize that enough. That was his calling card. And it was a great venue for wrestling.
It was. You knew it. It felt like a big arena because the lights went down, the center lights were on the ring, the action itself. It had that nostalgic feel of a miniature Madison Square Garden. It just, it came off that way because that's what he was used to visually and auditorially, and that's what he made happen. Again, excellent promotion.
The high ceilings.
Yes.
The lighting.
The acoustics of that.
It was done very, very well.
The pacing.
Even from the ceilings, it would say Section A, Section B, Section C.
Yep.
Clearly defined. If you had a ticket that said Section B, you weren't wandering around, well, where do I sit? Where do I sit?
Yep.
You looked up and you could see, well, this is the section I should be in.
Exactly.
It was so well done in that regard. It was a great place for wrestling.
It was. Speaking of a great place for wrestling and feeling great about it, goes to my number 2. My number 2 and my number 1 will forever be intertwined. My number 2, both of them have to do with Ed Zahn. Number 2, Win, Wrestling Independent Network. That was a offshoot of a previous business venture. And it was Ed Zahn's, Jeff Capo's, their baby. They were running with it. You were part of it on the behind the scenes. You did the conventions and those types of things to build the product. And it was exactly like how Larry Sharp did his. They built a product. They built a product name. They gave it legitimacy. And they focused on their 3 champions. Their tag, their light, and their heavyweight. And then they brought in the things that augmented it. The ladies, midgets. And they infused it with big names, with developed local stars. And in order to get on that to get booked by those guys, you had to be a worker. You weren't going to take somebody just because, he's going to sell tickets. No, I'm about my product. And that's what I'll forever treasure about what Ed Zahn did with Win. And it sits so high because he used me as one of the centerpieces. So I am forever thankful because from his booking me and putting me into matches like with the Lightning Kid, with Chris Candido, those things, elevated my abilities and my ability to travel. And again, so I'm eternally grateful for that. But it segues right into my number one. My number one has got to be UIW. And the reason I chose UIW as my number one, because it's like your very first love, right? There's always that special place. It's like
Right.
your very first girlfriend who you will forever remember. May not be your wife, may not be your, but you will always go back to those thoughts because it was your very first one where all those experiences were brand new. For me, the UIW had it all. Television, local television that was real, legitimate. The moving into like the cable portions of public access, not cable, I should say public access. They had the radio stations that were putting them on, that were talking about those events. It traveled. There was a legitimate TV studio that was shooting post-production materials, the covering of the live events, the magazine coverage. The talent that was there was good, but needed to be worked. And that was part of the labor of love of the entire thing, is there was the potential. And had it been able to succeed, it did succeed, but had it been able to succeed longer, you would have had those greater developments like I talked about with Rasta when I talked about, developing great heels. So I will always look at my number one and number two intertangled, but number one going to UIW solely, and Ed was involved, Jeff Capo was involved, you were behind the scenes, Phil was behind the scenes, Brian was behind the scenes. A lot of introduction into how a professional organization moves, forward. And I think it also set the model for a lot of people. It was very close to being ECW before ECW was. It was very, very, very tangent to TWA.
It was on the cusp of doing something so much bigger. And it's very unfortunate that it only had a 13-week
Right.
television run on WJZ. And it was very unfortunate that it was in that time slot
Right.
that it was. I think perhaps if it had a better time slot, it would have done a lot better. But that would have taken an additional investment
Right.
in the television time, which I don't think anyone was willing to
Forgo at that time, right.
do that at that time. I don't think that everyone saw the potential. I don't think everyone shared the same vision going forward with that project. But you're right, it certainly had great potential, and it proved that there was an audience for independent wrestling in the Baltimore area.
It created the hotbed. It really did.
It set the embers on fire.
Right.
Now, it didn't erupt into a wildfire, but the embers were there. And later on, when those embers got stirred up a little bit, then we saw the fire.
All right, Tim. With that, my 8 being stated, the floor is yours.
Wow. That's a really, really good top 8.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to see if I can top your top 8.
I think you can.
Maybe I might have an ace up my sleeve.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Let's start at the top. No place to start like number 1.
Okay.
My number 1